personally been affected. Many of us have personally been affected by issues of anti-Semitism in the arts. Some of us have been actively engaged in combating it. We hope that today's session can serve as an opportunity to hear from professionals in the field, to have some of our questions answered, and to determine in the arts world in Toronto includes many years on the board, and then as chair of the Koffler Center of the Arts, many years as chair of Arts, Culture, and Heritage for UJA Federation, serving on Ontario Arts Council, and many years on the management committee and board of Partners in Art, an arts organization that funds contemporary visual arts projects and educates its members about contemporary arts. My experience in Partners in Art has led me to be exposed to examples of anti-Semitic rhetoric on the Instagram sites and websites of numerous arts organizations. PIA instituted a funding policy which would ensure that every organization receiving a PIA grant would have to have in place a human rights policy. PIA's funding policy is based on the Ontario Human Rights Code and on the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And it states that PIA opposes any discrimination, stereotypes, or generalizations based on race, national or ethnic origin, color, religion, age, sexual orientation, etc., etc. As such, it has lately had anti-Semitism issues to deal with in its funding decisions. I give much credit to the tenacious leaders on both the project development, which is the granting committee, and the education committee at PIA, who have dealt with and continue to deal with issues of anti-Semitism. These are only the issues I've been directly involved with in Toronto. Unfortunately, we know of and will hear of many more. We're all here today because this is a moment of truth for the Toronto Jewish community and for all of us who believe in freedom and justice, especially within the arts and culture space. Many of us have had to face situations that range from uncomfortable interactions to outright anti-Semitism with fellow artists, proprietors, gallery owners, arts professors, faculty members, students, DEI staff, patrons of the arts, arts institutions, and more. Today, you will hear from a stellar panel who, on our behalf, are working diligently to combat anti-Semitism. Unfortunately, Noah Shack was called away last minute to a critical meeting with government officials. We are pleased to have in his place Vice President of Communications, Steve McDonald, to speak on the work of Noah and his team. In Steve's comments, we will also hear generally about the increased community security and anti-Semitism strategy that UJA has had to pursue, given the current climate of hate across the GTA. It is now my great pleasure to introduce our panel. I'll give a brief introduction of each member, and that member will speak for a couple of minutes. When all panelists have been introduced and have given us their initial thoughts, we will pose questions to them, first as a panel and then specifically to each one. We will do our best to answer all questions, but any we don't get to, we will follow up with after the webinar. In 2021, following the last crisis in Israel, we saw a significant rise in anti-Semitism in the GTA. It was at that time that UJA embarked on initiatives that increased the work within the anti-Semitism file to combat the hate in Ontario. Our first panelist, Steve McDonald, UJA's VP of Communications, will speak on behalf of Noah Shack, who heads up the anti-Semitism and hate portfolio. Steve will speak about UJA's work in this area and how that applies to the arts and culture community. He will also address incidents that have arisen and that UJA, along with other community partners, are combating. Our next panelist is Rabbi Seth Goren, CEO and President of Hillel Ontario. Seth joins us today to brief us on the atmosphere felt on campus by Jewish students, particularly those in arts programs. We will hear about the strategies and advocacy that have been undertaken and how it is addressing the needs of students in the arts and culture space on campus and across all faculties. Our third panelist is Michael Murray, the CEO of the Ontario Arts Council. As a part of the OAC's ongoing commitment to diversity, Michael has made a commitment to address the rise in anti-Semitism. Michael and the OAC are aware of incidents within the arts community that make the Jewish and Israeli communities of Ontario feel isolated and threatened. Michael will discuss the process that the OAC has established to review, process, and decide upon incident alerts. He will also provide an update regarding the OAC's work to combat anti-Semitism and what artists can do to make an impact and effect change. And finally, Sam Ogolonsky. Sam is UJA's Director of Arts, Culture, and Heritage. She works with all members of our community in the arts and culture space. She has engaged in many conversations over the past few months and joins us today representing the stories that have been shared and the thoughts and incidents that have been expressed by those across the arts and culture spectrum. So first, we'd like to give, as I said, each panelist a couple of minutes to give us an introduction to their work with community and how it has pivoted over the past 3 months. So Steve, please start us off, followed by Michael, Seth, and finally Sam. Steve.
Thank you so much, Jill, and thank you to everyone for joining us, especially my fellow panelists. I feel really, really privileged to be a part of this, and it's such a timely and important conversation. And the fact that people are setting aside their time today to delve into this with us, speaks volumes about what's happening, but also about this incredible, incredible arts community. Very quickly about UJA, because people often ask, what is UJA? UJA exists for one very simple purpose. It's to bring together all of the talent and all of the strength of the Greater Toronto Jewish community in common cause. Whether that common cause is helping people struggling with poverty in the city during the pandemic, whether that common cause is strengthening Jewish education and culture throughout the city, or right now, in particular with anti-Semitism, that common cause is ensuring that not only that the Jewish community can be safe and continue to be openly and proudly Jewish in this city, but so that all communities can have their rights to be who they are and to live openly and proudly as who they are in this city, respected for the future. And so the times that we're in are pretty exceptional, but I just want to start by saying thank you to everyone on this call who's really a part of UJA. Whether you're a volunteer leader like Jill or Rachel, whether you're professional staff like Sam, Seth at a partner agency that we work with, but also partners like Michael and people in the broader Toronto community who are working with us to address these issues. We can't do this work without people giving their time, giving financially, and giving their expertise. And really this panel is a microcosm of that. So I just want to start with gratitude for everyone who's a part of this really important work. Jill, you gave a really eloquent introduction about how what's happening on the other side of the world is tragic and painful, but it's also directly impacting us here. And one of the things that I think is really particularly concerning is that anti-Semitism in general tends to thrive on destabilized societies. When people are polarized, when people are tearing each other apart, when the boundaries of society are being stretched and pushed in dangerous directions, those currents tend to turn themselves against, frankly, many minority communities, but Jews historically in particular tend to experience that pain. And that's really what we're seeing right now. We're seeing it in many different forms, and I won't give a long laundry list of the things that our community is experiencing right now. But I can tell you in all of my time working with the Jewish community, and I've worked on this issue for 14 years, and so it's not that long compared to many people who've been doing this work for many years, but I think they would agree. I've never seen the community this concerned about safety, this concerned about our secure place of belonging in society, whether it's on campus, whether it's in the workplace, whether it's in sectors like arts and culture. And, this is primarily affecting Jewish Canadians, but this is a Canadian problem because in many ways, Jews historically, as I mentioned, have been the canary in the coal mine about something that's breaking down in society. So let's talk about what's breaking down. From my perspective, there are a few things that we're really directly trying to address with our anti-Semitism strategy. We're trying to address the breakdown of accountability for behavior that, frankly, society shouldn't accept. And accountability isn't a punitive statement. It's a statement that says there are certain things that are acceptable, and there are certain things that society has to say, this is not acceptable. Either it's legally not acceptable, like it's not acceptable to vandalize a Jewish community center, which is happening. There have got to be legal consequences. But then there are things that are not illegal, but for which society should say this shouldn't be accepted, and we have to speak out against it. And again, that's not a punitive statement. It's about society reaffirming the values that are supposed to unite us as Canadians. And a big part of that is allies. And the way that we're going to build allies is through the sort of cultural connections in particular that the arts sector affords. And so when we look at pushing back against anti-Semitism in any sector, including in the arts, really we want to make it clear this is about protecting the values that define the art sector itself, the value of freedom of expression, the value of inclusion, not just for Jews, but for everyone, but also making it clear that if we're going to stand for those values, we also have to stand against what's wrong. We have to stand against cultural boycotts. We have to stand against the things that are happening that are punitive against Jews, but ultimately will be punitive against everyone who cares about living in this kind of society. I've talked a lot. I'm going to pass the mic over to Michael, but I'm really pleased to be a part of this conversation. So thank you, Jill.
Thanks, Jill, and thank you, Steve. And thanks to everyone who's been involved in putting together today's webinar. As Jill said, my name is Michael Murray, and I'm the CEO of Ontario Arts Council. For those who aren't familiar with what we do, we're an agency of the Government of Ontario and the province's primary funder of not-for-profit arts activity, professional not-for-profit arts activity, in all disciplines, all artistic disciplines, and all across the province. So yes, definitely the GTA, but again, all across the province in every community. We granted it every community last year. We operate at arm's length from the government, which means that we report to a board of directors that oversees all of our policies and operations. Jill was mentioned. Jill was on our board. We're very thankful for her time on the board. And decisions about who receives funding also happen at arm's length from the government through peer assessment. So this ensures applications are evaluated by artists and arts professionals with knowledge and experience to the work being assessed. The Ontario Arts Council recently released our strategic plan about a year ago and titled Reset, Renew, Revitalize. And equity, diversity, and inclusion are a set of goals, a central set of goals in the plan. And that goes both internally for our staff and board and our panels, but also externally for the community, for the arts community. And we continually review our funding programs, services, and operations and partnerships to ensure that Ontario's diversity is fully reflected in the artistic activity it supports. We also aim to foster a work environment and a panel environment that is equitable, inclusive, and representative of the diversity of our province. And we endeavor for the arts community, which we serve, to do the same. So that brings me to a key reason I was happy to join this panel and some things I wanted to share. Is that an initiative we've been working on related to this topic. The Ontario Arts Council, more than a year ago, issued a request for expressions of interest to generate resources from the community to create a greater appreciation of the diversity of Jewish culture, identity, experience, and artistic practice within Ontario arts community. This process began again over a year ago and is the continuation of a commitment to and recognition of Jewish contributions to the arts in our province. In other words, it predates the horrors of October 7th, and it was always intended and is intended and now is intended to be an initiative for the moment, which is much different, but also one that serves as a resource for the arts for many years to come. One element, what we're looking for in this project, a successful proponent will develop a self-assessment tool for arts organizations. And this is like an educational tool, but also a moment for arts organizations to check in with themselves. So the goal is to help them reflect on how they are including the diversity of Jewish culture in their equity, diversity, and inclusion and belonging strategies, and also how they are preventing and responding to anti-Semitism in their anti-racism work and their anti-racism workplace policies. Again, prior to October 7th, we saw somewhat of a gap in some of the policies that we were viewing. We've talked about a lot about our own policies, and we thought folks need resources and education in order to fill that gap. And we thought that was a missing piece, so we're really looking forward to that. In terms of the idea of the RFP and building these resources in the community, this is a new method for us. So we're hoping we can use it as a model for other communities to encourage learning. And so we are all making connections and decisions with greater knowledge and greater appreciation. Obviously, this is not the only community that suffers from discrimination and hate, and we think a lot of that is based on lack of knowledge. So we see this as a real pilot that would be repeated in other communities and other contexts. The RFP deadline hasn't passed, so therefore the project hasn't started, and we don't exactly know the shape of the project because that'll be up to the proponent. But we're going to keep folks up to date as soon as that happens. That's our main external initiative to address anti-Semitism through and in the arts. But also wanted to talk very briefly about internally. We had a complete new suite of anti-discrimination training for every staff member last year, and anti-Semitism training was part of that general suite. And we are deepening our work. Next month, we'll have a half-day session dedicated entirely to anti-Semitism, so that our staff also, probably earlier than, no, not probably, earlier than the resource for the arts community in general, there'll be resources for staff so that they understand the nuances and the particular nature of anti-Semitism when compared to other forms of discrimination. And we're looking forward to our staff really, leveling up in this subject area. Our staff asked for it explicitly, obviously as part of the moment, but we were already planning it, so everything has come together. We're excited. So I know I'm speaking very positively when there's, and this, this is a very difficult subject, and this is these are the things I'm excited to share about. I know there's some other questions, and I think I'll get to those in the general question area. But thank you all once again for including me, and I believe I am passing it on to my friend Seth.
Thanks, Michael. And thank you all for being here. Thanks so much for everyone for all of the work that you are doing. I met last night with members of the Jewish Identity Committee at UJA. And in truth, none of what we do on campus would be possible without the support of UJA, of other community partners, and of so many volunteer individuals, including so many people here on this call. I'm going to try and keep it short to talk about campus because I know that there are questions that are going to go into a little bit more detail. But to step back for a moment and just talk about what is Hillel Ontario. So Hillel Ontario is a multi-campus Hillel. We are a student-centered organization that supports and amplifies and empowers Jewish life on 9 campuses across the provinces where we have staff. And we also work with additional schools across the province, including OCAD, George Brown, Brock, and Trent, as well as other universities. I want to talk about what's changed and what some of our response has been to the changes we've seen on campus. In the immediate aftermath of October 7th, a lot of what we saw was pure and simple grief and fear. That this was, in some ways, kind of a new experience on campus. I've been working on campus at this point, I think, for about 12 years. I don't remember people feeling as scared and as distraught as people were in the aftermath of October 7th. We've seen plenty of flare-ups in the Middle East. There usually is a defensiveness that comes with it, but this was different. Our students who are most likely to be involved with Hillel and involved in advocacy were those who were most likely to be traumatized by what happened in Israel on that day. And they were the students that we needed to be there for, as opposed to calling on them to be more active in those first couple days. But in truth, all of this comes down to one statistic that I think speaks volumes, that between October 7th and the end of the semester, we had 3 times as many incidents on campus that were reported to us of anti-Semitism as we had in all of last academic year. That kind of spike, I think, reflects what's been going on in society as a whole, but that indicates the depth of the challenge that we are facing. And whereas before October 7th, I would have said, yes, there are a lot of problems on campus, and these are the things that we do to address them, but campus is not on fire. I would say that last semester, campus was as close to on fire as I have experienced since I started doing this work. I could go through the litany of different types of incidents that have taken place. I don't believe that listing them and going through them is going to necessarily give anyone any degree of comfort or provide anyone with a better sense as what's going on. I will just simply say that the threats that students have gotten have been over social media. They have been in-person threats. They have been inappropriate comments in class where there's an imbalance in relationships between professors and students. There are all different types of things that have been going on, and many of them are really pretty horrible. What have we been doing in response to this? I would kind of focus on a couple of different areas. I would start off by what are we doing with students? We recognize that different students approach advocacy in different ways, and I'm happy to talk about that in the question part. But the two primary things that we do is we support students and encourage them to report what is happening. So in essence, it's support and report. Support is going to look different for different students. There's some students who are just going to come to us and say, like, this is what I need from you. And like, this is just a moment that I need of your time just to share with you what happened to me. And we are there for that. There are some students who say, I want to really take a much more activist stance. I want to organize my friends to go out and do something very public. Again, we support students in doing that, recognizing that advocacy is different for different students. We also, and we think that this is critical, we encourage students to report what has happened to them, not just to Hillel, but also to the appropriate authorities. Usually that means navigating university systems that hold people accountable, that Steve had talked about, that many of these things that are not necessarily legal repercussions. We recognize that on campus, the disciplinary or the accountability mechanisms are not often designed to impose, I would say, punishments, but really to help people learn and to hold them accountable in a way that allows them to grow, that is ideally how they function. It requires students to figure out, how do I report this? Whom do I share this with? How do I make sure that there actually is accountability through this process? And we support them in navigating that. I would also say that another key component of what we do, and a key component of our advocacy strategy more broadly, is having pre-existing relationships with non-Jews on campus, including administration. One of the things that we found is that in the aftermath of October 7th, we were able to activate those relationships. We were able to get the dean of students for a university on a call on a Friday afternoon when they were supposed to be heading town, or talk to the president of this university on a Sunday to share with them some of what was going on and what we needed from them right then and there. We were able to talk to the head of student activities to make sure our campuses had the additional security that they needed when students came back from fall break and reading week, and our students felt like they were going to be under physical threat. That all of those different things wouldn't have been possible if we had not spent years building those relationships, getting to know those people so that they were willing to take our calls when we needed them most. So those are two of the key pillars of what we do, the idea of working with Jewish students and then working with our allies on campus, which is critical. To talk about how this affects kind of the arts and culture community in particular, what we found is that the response to October 7th has been different for students depending on their identities. And there are some identities I want to just kind of mention in passing, because that's where we've seen it's different often from how other Jewish students are responding. We've seen in the LGBTQ+ community, for Jews of color, and for Jews who are either in interfaith relationships or whose parents are an interfaith couple, that working with them is very different from working with people who do not carry those identities. And arts and culture students, Jewish students who are involved in arts on campus, is also different. Because often those are communities that are asking people to make choices that are unfair and unreasonable. They are being asked to choose between being Jewish and to being a part of the community that is also a core part of who they are and how they carry themselves in the world. And what we try to do is work with those students in giving them the confidence that they can be Jewish in other spaces. And we also give them a space in which we are welcoming of them as entire people. We do not ask them to leave part of who they are at the door. And that is something that has been key to be able to support people who are in really challenging situations outside of the Jewish community that they're a part of on campus. Again, happy to speak a little bit more about that later, but I think I'm at this point supposed to turn it over to Sam.
Thank you, Seth, and good morning, everyone. And thank you again for joining today. My name is Sam Bogolonsky, and I am the Director of Arts, Culture, and Heritage at UJA Federation of Greater Toronto. UJA is the hub of Jewish life in Toronto, and my role focuses on promoting Jewish culture and heritage in the GTA. I'm privileged to work with dedicated professionals, volunteers, and arts leaders from the community, and a few of whom I think are in the audience, so thank you for joining us. Through UJA grants made available through the generous philanthropy of members of our community, we support a wide range of Jewish arts programming, including visual arts, film, performance, music, heritage, and literature. UJA supports the following partner organizations through this work: the Toronto Jewish Film Festival, the Committee for Yiddish, the Harold Green Jewish Theatre Company, the Ashkenaz Festival, the Koffler Center of the Arts, and the Kultura Collective, which is comprised of these organizations, plus additional Toronto-based Jewish arts and culture organizations and our Jewish community centers. In supporting these arts institutions, we are recognizing that arts and culture are an important avenue for the expression of Jewish identity and an on-ramp to Jewish engagement. Over the past few months, we've seen a rise in anti-Semitism across Toronto, and the arts community, unfortunately, has not been immune to this spike. Since October 7th, I've been speaking with fellow artist friends, cultural workers, board members, collectors, curators, and funders who have concerns about anti-Semitism in this community. While there is an overwhelming sense of sadness and fear, I've also found this to be a moment of coming together as a Jewish arts community. And I believe this is a time where we need to celebrate our Jewish culture and amplify it through the arts. In late November, with the support of Canvas, the Toronto Holocaust Museum, and the Prosserman JCC, we convened over 100 cultural professionals and artists for the Jewish Futures Arts and Culture Salon. The day was created for Toronto's Jewish artists and cultural workers to come together to explore the future of Jewish cultural and artistic life. Considering the current moment, this felt more important than ever. The programming was designed to give Jewish creatives a chance to connect, learn, and share. The goal of the day was to build community resilience and grow our cultural leadership in Toronto, and I left feeling inspired by the amazing Jewish creatives who shared their practices and stories with me and everyone else in the group. And I hope in today's conversation, we will be able to offer suggestions and best practices for how to support Jewish artists and creatives right now. And I'd like to thank you in advance for attending this webinar and for your time as we consider these very troubling but important issues.
Well, thank you, Sam, and thank you to all the panelists. Really appreciate your few minutes of, informing us and briefing us about anti-Semitism in the arts and anti-Semitism in general in our community. So we have some questions, and I'm hoping that more questions are coming in on the chat, and we will ask those questions as we get them. And as I mentioned before, if there are any questions that have come in that we don't get to, we promise to follow up after this webinar. So the first question I'll pose to the panel, and there's no pressure for every member of the panel to respond, but I'll just pose the question, and whoever wants to pop in and answer. Artists' freedom of expression is fundamental to their work. With the conflict in the Middle East, there are inherent pressures on free expression that need to be navigated. Are there ways to strike an effective balance where artists' voices are heard in a way that is inclusive of all audiences? So maybe I can ask Steve to start us off with that question.
For sure, it's an important question, Jill. And look, I think, as I mentioned earlier, the boundaries of society are being pushed. And ironically, art in many ways exists to push boundaries in meaningful ways. All forms of art are really about provoking ideas and contrasting ideas, different experiences, understanding how people from different communities and backgrounds and cultures see things differently. All of that's a beautiful part of art. And no one can deny that. And artists, more than anyone, understand the dangers of censorship. So freedom of expression is really a critical part of being Canadian. But I think we also agree that there is no Canadian value that in and of itself can be used as a shield to harm others. And when you look at speech and hate speech, our society rightly recognizes that there is a high threshold for what constitutes hate speech versus speech that we just object to, which is not the same thing. But when you think about how this plays out in art, no one could deny, for example, that the Nazis made very effective use of art propaganda to advance their ideology. and we're able to use art as a tool to demonize Jews in ways that rightly today would be recognized as hate propaganda and probably be subject to Canada's criminal code, which bans hate propaganda. And so we have laws for these things, but the overwhelming majority of expressions of difficult viewpoints and contrasting viewpoints don't reach that threshold. And so I think from a Jewish community perspective, we need to be very clear about when is something inherently crossing a legal line, and that requires police intervention. And I can tell you, we alluded to it at the beginning a little bit, Jill. We have been vigilant in working closely with police since October 7th and before to ensure that police understand the needs of our community, that they're proactively protecting our community, but also so that they're going to places where Canadians who are out there doing what most people think is expressing their freedom of their freedoms, expressing their viewpoints in protests and whatnot. We also know that at some of these places, there is hateful things being said, and the boundaries are being pushed. And when we hear celebrations of violence, when we hear horrible things being said about Jews, including delegitimizing language about Jews, the language of extermination when talking about Jews and talking about Zionist-infested neighborhoods in Toronto, this is not acceptable. This is beyond the bounds of freedom of expression. So we've been very adamant that police need to enforce the laws that do exist for the rare cases where these things are happening. But also the things that don't reach that threshold, that are objectionable, that we take issue with, that we think are distortions, that are hurtful to our community, but are not illegal. This is where we really need education. We need allies, and what Michael and what the council is doing to address this proactively with education is really a critical tool. We need all of this because at the end of the day, it's that education and those kind of common cause efforts to address anti-Semitism, but not just hate, that are going to get us through this. Jill, I just want to add one more thing. One of the things that we do at UJA consistently is we take a data-driven approach. And since October 7th, we've conducted multiple public opinion studies to understand what Canadians feel about the current issues. And we conducted a similar study last year. And one of the most powerful things we found in the research is that if you are a Canadian outside the Jewish community who has a close Jewish friend or colleague, you are twice as likely to feel that Jews make a positive contribution to Canada, and you're twice as likely to strongly oppose anti-Semitism. So when I think about Jews in the art sector, the relationships you're forging through a common love of art and culture and that willingness to express yourself through different mediums and hear different viewpoints from different communities, that is a critical part of the solution. That's what opens the door to the kind of relationships and the kind of education that Michael and his team are going to be leading. And so, this is not one of these problems in society that any one organization or leader can take care of. We need the entire community to be a part of it, but that begins by opening the door to relationships through common interests like arts. So if we have that, I think we'll be able to not just take care of the illegal speech, but that harmful speech we're hearing that might not be illegal. We need allies to speak out and say, this doesn't belong in our space. You need to stop this. This is not acceptable.
Thank you so much, Steve. Is there anyone else that would like to address this question?
I'll just hop in with a couple points, Jill, if it's all right.
Sure.
So OAC does have a freedom of expression policy, and it's pretty fundamental, unsurprisingly, to OAC to affirm the right of the artist to create and present their work to the public and the right of the public to experience that work. However, the creation, production, presentation, or exhibition of artistic works that are in contravention of the Criminal Code of Canada or actions that are in contravention of the Ontario Human Rights Code would violate the terms and conditions of a grant. So that much is clear in terms of our policies. In terms of determining when something is in contravention with one of those laws, we are not a tribunal or a court. And so it's not that we don't make those decisions ever. It's just that we are cautious to make those decisions because of our, literally the capacity we have here on staff. Instead, what we usually rely on when there's areas of gray is the assessment panels. So who's on those assessment panels? What kind of expertise are we bringing on? How are we instructing those assessment panels? And when organizations or arts artists and their projects are assessed, these questions are subject to assessment and therefore will then affect future grant results. That's our real core competency. Our core competency in terms of legal investigation, less so. Now, mind you, if there was an external legal determination of some sort, we would absolutely respond to that. I would say even charges, but definitely any findings, we would respond to that very clearly. And we can respond before, but as I'm saying, our competencies are much more based in the assessment panel and how we charge them and how we determine future grant decisions in that area. And of course, it was great to hear from Steve that the line between the two and I've already talked about the education as an approach, and we would talk about these boundaries that aren't always clear between freedom of expression and I suppose hate and discrimination.
Great. Thank you, Michael. Anyone else want to address that question?
The only thing I just want to add very, very briefly is the fact that there's kind of the flip side to this that we see on campus, which is the idea of academic freedom. And often this is used as a shield to protect people who really are deserving of protection for sharing things that are germane to the subject that they're teaching and to the class that they are running. We often also see this as something that's invoked to allow people to justify their own anti-Semitic comments in class. And that navigating this can be very challenging in terms of what falls on which side of the line. We see a lot of times where professors who are teaching classes that have nothing to do with Middle East politics, including arts-related classes, who bring in topics that who bring in really, I would say, anti-Semitic topics as well as anti-Israel sentiment, and especially where the two conflate. And then say, this is due to academic freedom, I'm allowed to say this. So that's, I would say it's definitely kind of problematic. We also have a system of tenure that often protects people who engage in this type of conduct, and that removing tenure from professors can be a multi-year process that's arduous and challenging. And so I would just kind of echo what Steve said, is that sometimes there are consequences that we can bring to the fore in terms of allowing people to know that this conduct is unacceptable, even if we can't necessarily take legal or punitive action against the person who's engaging in that.
Thank you, Seth. Sam, did you want to pitch in with any comments on this question?
Well, I'll say briefly that I think that one thing that we need to consider is that institutions who provide the platform for artists to be showing their work need to be inclusive of Jewish voices as well as other voices. So we need to be around the table when decisions are being made and have our voices included as part of the dialogue for when programmatic or maybe curatorial conversations are happening.
Thank you, Sam. So can I direct a question, let's say starting with Seth? What are some maybe proactive as opposed to reactive ways to combat anti-Semitism, anti-Israelism being taught as a fact on campus? And a corollary to that is, how can alumni and donors support current Jewish students at Canadian universities?
No, I appreciate the question. I would say that there's a wide range of different things depending on people's interests, skills, and capacity. To take a step back in terms of the approach that we take is that we recognize that each student is an individual, and that each student's advocacy path is going to be different. There are some students for whom wearing a Magen David openly on campus is an act of advocacy for them, and that's what they're able to do. There are some students for whom coming to a Shabbat dinner for the first time is an act of advocacy. There are some students who are far more willing to be public about being Jewish, to be public advocates, and to be public activists for Jewishness, for Judaism, and for the Jewish community. What we seek to do is we seek to work with each student about what is going to work for them, as opposed to imposing a cookie cutter definition of what advocacy can look like. In terms of what it means to support them from off of campus, I think a lot of it is about what we've done this past semester is providing students with the opportunity to meet with community members. We've had a number of solidarity visits of people coming to visit campus, meeting with students, hearing from them, and reminding students that they're not alone. To the extent that people have relationships with university, that is something that is also excellent to be able to leverage and to let members of university in a targeted and specific way, where it's actually going to make a difference in students' lives, to let them know this is not acceptable, that this is going on your campus, and that there are ways in which you can take action to support Jewish students. A lot of it is about inviting people into the Jewish community. This was something that Steve mentioned, which is that we do not change the world around us by sealing ourselves off from it. We change the world by taking calculated risks, strategic risks, to engage with people who are convincible. So that, for example, one of the things that we're looking at, and we're in conversations with the OCAD administration about, is a visit to the Toronto Holocaust Museum, because this is something that, first of all, serves to educate, and it also sets an example for the rest of the university in terms of what they can be doing and what they should be doing to keep Jewish students safe. Other things that we can do, we get involved in politics on campus. We're coming up on campus election season, so a lot of it is about supporting candidates who are sympathetic to the Jewish community, who understand the challenges that Jewish students face. A lot of it is about building relationships with DEI offices. I know that this is often a phrase that people really are trying to keep an arm's length from these days, and I can understand to a certain extent why. The truth is, if we're able to leverage university resources to ensure that anti-Semitism is included in the list of oppressions that people experience, we're able to turn the work that the university is doing to our benefit and ensure that we're not doing this by ourselves. Because the truth of the matter is, a non-Jew who stands up there and says anti-Semitism is unacceptable and I am speaking out against it is going to be far more convincing and far more powerful and far more effective than any Jew who does it. That is a sad case, but that is a true way that the world tends to function. So that a lot of it is about making sure that our allies feel supported, feel empowered, feel knowledgeable, so that they can speak out on our behalf. And that is how we change campus in the broader world.
Well, thank you, Seth. I wonder if I can pose a question to Steve at this point. Is there anything our government can be doing to reduce anti-Semitism in the arts and to reduce anti-Semitism in the arts programs in universities? And what can we do to encourage the government to act on these initiatives? And someone out there asked a question about the government itself, and maybe you can answer this. Does the government's EDI or DEI program include anti-Semitism? So that's just a little sidebar.
So I am gonna defer to Seth on the campus question, because I think that's a really nuanced area in particular, especially given the academic implications. When it comes to government policy, look, my view is that we have to anchor all of this in something that the government, not just government of Canada, the government of Ontario, governments across the country and around the world have done, which is to anchor their understanding of anti-Semitism in the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition. This has been adopted as Canadian policy. This is being used by the Canadian Human Rights Commission, by the Ontario Human Rights Commission. This is being treated as the ultimate standard in understanding what is anti-Semitism, because we can all say that what we feel is anti-Semitic, but if there isn't some sort of widely accepted, consensus-based international definition, then you can't really identify it, and therefore you can't really address it, whether through education, whether through accountability measures, etc. And that International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition is very simple. It's really rooted in what used to be called 3 Ds. Anti-Semitism as it pertains to Israel. Obviously, there are many other non-Israel related expressions of anti-Semitism, but anti-Semitism related to Israel is that which consists of language that demonizes Israelis. So, for example, calling Israelis Nazis is horrific and anti-Semitic. Language that denies Israel's right to exist. So, for example, when we hear "from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free," which is a very specific phrase that if you ask probably nine people out of 10 who say it, they will tell you, if you ask them, we believe that it means Israel should be replaced with a different state in which Palestinians are a full majority, rather than a two-state solution, which has been the international consensus, where you have two people living side by side, achieving self-determination, living in peace, which is a very different premise. But as soon as you say from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, again, 90% of people who say that, whatever their intention is, the ultimate effect is the elimination of Israel, which, according to the IHRA definition, is anti-Semitic. And last but not least, double standards. When Israel is subjected to standards that no other democracy in the world is subjected to, you have to question whether there's systemic bias at play. I'll give one quick example, Jill. 2022, long before this war began, in fact, the year that Ukraine was invaded by Russia, if you look at UN General Assembly resolutions, more than half of UN General Assembly resolutions were focused on Israel and were critical of Israel. Do we really think that more than half of the UN's time in a single year, long before this war, should have been focused on the state of Israel? I would say that's disproportionate. I would say that's not something any other country has to experience, and I would call it institutional bias against the Jewish state, and by definition, the Jewish people. And so, to your point, Jill, this is, this is not inconsistent with recognizing that legitimate policy criticism that Israelis frankly level at their own government, is no different than policy criticism of the Canadian government. That's part of being democratic, and no one should call legitimate policy criticism anti-Semitic. But this definition, this has got to be not just on paper and not just on a government website, Jill. To your point, we want to see this being used everywhere where EDI is taking place, everywhere where there are people, to Michael's point about how none of us are on a court, but there are people who are looking at human rights complaints. There are tribunals that are trying to determine, is this anti-Semitic or not? There's a tool available. It's internationally endorsed. It needs to be used. And Jill, I think when it comes to countering anti-Semitism domestically, the most important thing this government can do is take that definition, boldly and openly affirm it, especially in moments like this one, and then ensure that it is resourced as a tool to be used by those people who are around the country working to actually protect the rights of Jewish Canadians and all Canadians.
Well, thank you, Steve. I hope we can do that. I want to ask then, Seth, could you maybe fill in dealing with what our government might be able to do in helping the arts programs in universities?
Sure. So I would echo Steve's comments about the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism. It's something that's been adopted by the federal government, by the provincial government. It's something that we've brought up with university administrators in terms of asking them to adopt it on campus. It's something that we do advocate for. What's often been indicated to us in response is that is concerns on the part of administrators that if they attempt to adopt it openly on campus, that it will actually be explicitly rejected by various student unions, faculty unions on campus. Whereas now there's a little bit more flexibility because they can just say, this is what the province has adopted, this is what we're using, that they feel comfortable relying on it in that context and for that purpose, even if it's not expressly adopted. In terms of what does this look like kind of for the arts community on campus, it's difficult to say. I think that it plays out in different ways depending on the setting. I would say that part of the challenge is that the accountability measures on campus are not as strong as we would like, and this is a more general problem that often kind of the way that students have to work their way through them can be a little bit difficult. But when it comes to trying to figure out what is anti-Semitic and what is not on campus, we push for the IHRA definition in terms of what that can mean. What I would also say is that most of the things we've been seeing since October 7th don't need any intricate definition of anti-Semitism to be defined as anti-Semitism. You don't need like a definition to tell me that if someone repeatedly rips off someone's mezuzah from their doorframe and throws it down the hall, that's anti-Semitic. Like IHRA or not, like that is not okay and it is anti-Semitic, period. A lot of the things that we've been seeing since October 7th are like that. They're in that vein. Steve is right. When we hear from the river to the sea, when we hear about global intifada, like these are calls for violence and genocide. We feel quite comfortable advocating for that and pointing that out. Administrators tend to be supportive of that. There are contexts in which we actually can raise that. So for example, if a professor says something like that in a class, that's something that we can actually bring to the administration's attention and say, this is promoting hatred. This crosses a line and there should be accountability for things like that. It is a little bit more difficult when it takes place on Instagram, where many students live most of their lives, to be able to not just call that out, but to say, this is something that should be, there should be accountability for this. And some schools are great, some are not as great. And that's actually one of the biggest challenges that we face. When we engage with this many campuses, with this many universities, there are some pockets of each university and some universities that are going to be better than others. And that's something that we really want to do in terms of elevating and lifting up the campus responses that have been positive, while also trying to hold administrations accountable when they engage in behavior and aren't holding people responsible for anti-Semitism that they're engaging in on campus. So I would say it's an incredibly complicated and nuanced issue, but that what we do is we go into conversations using IHRA as the touchstone definition, the consensus Jewish definition, where we define our own oppression of what anti-Semitism is, and we have I don't think it's the luxury, or the benefit, but we are able in a post-October 7th world to be able to say, this is anti-Semitic, choose your definition, it is. And that's it.
Okay, Seth, thanks. So we'll have maybe time for one more question, and I'll ask Michael Murray. So thank you for what you said, coming from the OAC, and you're a major fundraising organization for all arts in Ontario. And as such, you have a lot of credibility, a lot of respect. So are you prepared to leverage your influence on artists and arts organizations to recognize and combat anti-Semitism? You mentioned a lot of this in what you said, but I wonder if you can elaborate on what it is, what the training, will you be doing training for your own staff? I think you mentioned you would be, and how would it play out with the other arts organizations that receive funding from you?
Yeah, thank you for that, Jill. So I already shared our large initiative in this area, and it's new. Really, before this current plan, we primarily enacted our mandate through granting programs, and the idea of a larger partnerships framework is something new in this plan. And this is one of the first DEI focused partnerships we're seeking. So we are taking some risks there, and the right risks, and we are going out and what we'll do is align with a partner to support resources for the arts community. And I think that OAC as a public arts funder aligning and signaling that we're doing so is one of the ways that we're eager to combat discrimination in general, but definitely just combat anti-Semitism, and also to champion the diversity of the Jewish community and to educate the general arts community and build that resource. And I think with our name behind it, and it remains to be seen because we need to see where it sits between the proponent, but at the very least, it'll be OAC sharing, championing, and often we don't do that, by the way. Outside of a partnership, we don't try to select resources for folks because of how much influence we have, but we see through this new partnership framework and through this process, we've done all of our due diligence to select a partner. Well, we haven't selected a partner yet, but a partner will be selected, and we will do so. So I think that's one of the big ways. I think the other ways is we plan on guiding our assessment panels in terms of not just this issue, but in the social and political causes of arts organizations and how assessment panels should take on this very challenging subject. And we're just working on this now, and then when we guide the panel in that way, there will be some material in that, and we will share that material publicly. So that's much more general. That's not only in this subject matter, but hopefully we're all going to take what we really like to see is make sure that the arts community is making educated, deliberate choices in aligning with these causes, any causes, and that we want to see connection to their artistic mandates. We want to see a real logic flowing, that we're still defending freedom of expression, but we're seeing in the arts community that people were educated and people were understanding the risks they were taking in their programming. but we still want folks to take risks. That's the challenge, right? So all of that, we're planning to do all of that, and we're really eager to launch these initiatives.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you all of you for your wonderful comments, insight, and I think she has some other words of thanks for the great panelists. And Rachel, are you coming on? There you go. There you go. Okay. Thanks again, all of you.
Thank you to Steve, Michael, Seth, Jill, and Sam for sharing your perspectives on arts and anti-Semitism. We look forward to seeing how the initiatives and ideas you mentioned progress. Today is just the beginning. We want to continue the conversation and ensure that everyone's voice is heard through whatever medium is most comfortable. This week, you will receive a follow-up email from UJA. It will include a survey for your feedback on future engagement and opportunities online and in person. It will also address any unanswered questions and include the panelists' contact information. In the chat, we will include the email address for Allison Weiss. Please share your story with us following this webinar or at any point in the weeks and months to come. When thousands were killed on October 7th, our community wanted to take immediate action. We mobilized quickly. We launched the emergency appeal. We raised $60 million within 1 week. To date, over 11,200 donors have generously given over $75 million to the emergency appeal. While our efforts and work have just begun, the community has come together in support of our work, and we will continue these efforts throughout 2024. None of this is possible without your support and the work of UJA. Thank you again for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you all in person or on Zoom at our next event.
Thanks, Rachel, and thanks to all of you. Have a great day.